Welcome, everyone, and it is my distinct pleasure to be moderating this panel with such distinguished people. Honestly, when I was asked, I was both chuffed and daunted by what was my job in this forum. So let me begin briefly by introducing people who need no introduction, but just for the sake of formality. I'll begin with Nadine Strossen, who is the John Marshall Harlan, the second professor of law emerita at NY Law School. And what's interesting is that she took emerita status in 2019, I believe, so that she could advocate and speak freely, even more freely, for free expression. She gives hundreds and hundreds of talks each year, and it's really a miracle. We were just at another conference, and I left last night to be here this morning, and she left at 3 a.m., so she attended the whole thing. She runs on no sleep whatsoever. She's also the author of Free Speech and What Everyone Needs to Know, and also Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech. These are just a couple of her publications. I'll turn now to Professor Keith Whittington. He is the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School as of this year. Now, prior to this year, he served as the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton, and he is the founder of the Academic Freedom Alliance. I'm a proud member of it. It's a coalition of faculty who stand up for the academic freedom of other faculty. He's the author. He's another one who I think doesn't sleep, so I think we're a pretty sleep-deprived panel over here. He writes all the time. He's the author of several books and many, many articles, most notably Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. And most recently, You Can't Teach That, The Battle Over University Classrooms, a book that I have read and highly recommend. And last but not least, we have JoAnn Koob. She is professor and director of the Liberty and Law Center at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And the center focuses on the role of law in protecting and promoting liberty and challenging government regulation of individual liberty. JoAnn's research includes topics like free speech and the press, corporate and political speech, and nonprofit law. So our panel today is focusing on civil liberties on campus. I couldn't think of a more timely issue for us to be passing. So I'll begin by asking a very basic question, which is, Nadine, perhaps we'll start with you. How do you define civil liberties as the former ACLU president?
I was asked by journalists constantly to define the ACLU's mission. And to me, it's quite simple that the goal is to defend and promote all fundamental freedoms for all people, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe. By virtue of being human, you are entitled to full and equal rights. And to me, that is just the Enlightenment philosophy that is reflected in the Declaration of Independence. That said, of course, every single word in that formulation can be debated. And through the course of the ACLU's history, it certainly has expanded its concept of civil liberties. And I think the same thing is true, in fairness, of the United States Supreme Court and probably the public as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Keith or JoAnn, would you like to add to that? Anything you think that Nadine didn't cover?
No, as a short statement, I think that's a perfectly good start to think about. I mean, one of the challenges of thinking about civil liberties, I think, in a university context in particular, is as you say, these are generalizable, universal sort of ideals that we think about in the polity more broadly, and then there are real questions about to what degree should those same concepts apply in their full scope in the context of a university. Is that equally true in a private university context, for example, in a public university context? If so, where and how should it apply in a university context? And so one thing that's challenging about universities, especially thinking about just the speech element, is they are very complex speech environments. And so we expect very different norms and practices to be at play in a classroom context or a seminar context than what we expect to see on the public quad, for example. And that poses real challenges for universities universities both to think through what justifies those differences and justifies recognizing civil liberties at all on a university campus, and then what the details of those practices ought to actually look like.
I'm really grateful for you making that distinction about what kind of speech is permissible in the classroom versus on the quad. I think a lot of the conversation about speech on campus, particularly pertaining to protest, has been impoverished by the fact that people don't distinguish between the two. So, JoAnn, perhaps I'll start with you with my first question. Let me begin with a quote by Judge Kevin Newsom. This was a couple of years ago when he said, colleges and universities serve as the founts of testing and grounds for new ideas. Their chief mission is to equip students to examine arguments critically, and perhaps even more importantly, to prepare young citizens to participate in the civic and political life of our democratic republic. Now, taking that quote seriously, what comes to mind is that learning to raise your voice and protesting is a very important part of being an active citizen. Yet, what we've seen over the course of the last year is that protests on campus have been clamped down upon. In fact, cops have been called in. We've seen heads being broken on pavements, both of faculty and students. So I'd like you to perhaps reflect a little bit on how do you see the ways in which institutions have navigated their mission, this dual mission of fulfilling critical thinking, but also training citizens. And what do you think about the ways in which the institutions have responded in the moment?
I mean, well, we've obviously seen a lot of varied responses by universities and how they've handled these. I think one of the more concerning issues we see with how universities have responded to protests is when we see them treat different protesters in different viewpoints differently. And so if a university is going to allow an encampment for a certain point of view, then they also have to allow that encampment for a view that maybe they dislike a lot less. And when they start distinguishing between ideas, they're really taking a side in what should be, it's a student protest, student ideas, students can navigate them. And universities have every right to enforce their policies, but when they do, they really need to do so equally. And I think what's the most concerning to me is when they're taking a side in these wars instead of being a forum to create the debate, to allow the debate, and to allow that speech to happen.
Right, so let me pose that question to you, Keith, and ask you, where do we draw the line between what is legitimate protest and when do we see it as encroaching on the educational mission?
Yeah, so I think it's worth emphasizing that the primary purpose of universities is to provide an educational function. And we think that's compatible with training democratic citizens and the like. But at the heart, universities need to be pursuing their scholarly and educational mission. And then the question is, how else do we organize other activities on campus in a manner that's compatible with that core concern of what universities are trying to operate? And of course, there's lots of other activities that occur on college campuses and properly ought to occur on college campuses. Some bridge up against that core commitment of educational functions a little better and more closely than others. But the goal is ultimately to make all of them function in a way that can coordinate across those campuses and are compatible with one another. And so if you're trying to make space, for example, for protest and expressive activities on college campuses, there's good reason to want to make space for that to happen. Partially, university campuses are important platforms and fora for having public conversations about matters of public concern. I think for public universities in particular, there's a particularly strong need and commitment on their part to make those campuses available as spaces in which democratic citizens can gather together and have conversations about matters of public concern, including members of the campus community, but also including people beyond the campus community. But when you're making those spaces available for that kind of activity, you also need to be able to make them available in ways ways that are compatible with and consistent with the other activities that also need to occur on campus, including most centrally the educational activities that occur on campus. And one thing that we've certainly seen be challenged over the last semester, and again, not a lot of clarity in the rhetoric surrounding universities, is the extent to which the expressive activities need to comply with what in constitutional law terms gets referred to as neutral time, place, and manner regulations associated with those expressive activities. So we're familiar with this in non-university spaces, or at least the law is familiar with this in non-university spaces in particular, of trying to say, look, if city wants to make available space or needs to make available space from a constitutional perspective for people to engage in protest activities or other expressive activities, they can also make rules around that use of that space that don't make distinctions based on the content of what people are saying. The state, or in this case, university administrators, shouldn't make distinctions about what messages are being conveyed, whose side are you on, engaging in expressive activities. But on the other hand, they can impose a set of rules that allow you to make use of that space and allow you to express those messages, but also don't interfere with what other people are doing. So for example, in a university context, you can't have loud expressive activities when other students are trying to sleep, which in normal spaces might mean the middle of the night, and university context might mean early in the morning. But, you know, nonetheless, you're trying to think about in this space. Likewise, you can't have loud expressive activities that are occurring just outside people's classrooms, where people are trying to study, people are trying to do their educational work and the like. And so there may be space restrictions about where you can have those expressive activities, maybe time restrictions about what those activities look like. There may be also other questions about what activities exactly are consistent with operating the university campus. So can you set up encampments and permanent structures, for example? What's the potential downsides of creating those kinds of things? But what's crucial is universities have neutral rules about doing it, that they actually enforce those rules in a consistent way, that they are clear with everybody about those rules, and they've really thought through those rules and trying to say we are allowing as much expressive activity as possible, consistent with the core educational functions of the university. And we've seen a lot of instances over the last semester in which faculty, students, other members of the on-campus community get themselves into trouble in various ways. They find themselves at odds with university administrators, and then they say, I'm simply being punished for expressing my opinions. And then you start probing and asking, well, how exactly were you expressing your opinions? And it turns out it's a lot less about the content of the opinions that are being expressed than how they're going about expressing it. It's the mere fact I was occupying a building or disrupting a class somehow has led the university officials to get on my back about the messages I'm being able to express. And universities have gotten themselves in some real difficulties because they've not been very consistent about those things. That they have cracked down much harder on some kinds of expressive activities than they have on others. They now want to say they're deeply committed to robust protections of expression on college campuses. But if you asked them 2 years ago, they would have been much more hesitant to have expressed those same kinds of commitments. And so it's important to think through those rules, think through how different kinds of activities are compatible on university campuses, and then actually be consistent about how we go about trying to implement those rules in practice.
If I can say, you know, one positive outcome of all of the chaos and confusion over the past year, and as an activist, I'm congenitally an optimist, but there has been a real educative function, right? I think everybody now has heard the phrase content neutral time, place, and manner regulations. Many universities and colleges spent an enormous amount of time and resources, which I think were very well invested over the summer, to study the existing rules, which were often inconsistent with each other, scattered all over the place, inconsistent with legal principles, and invested resources to clarify those principles, to bring them into accord with the First Amendment. And private campuses that have opted to honor the First Amendment were included in this process, and to communicate those rules clearly and forcefully, starting in orientation and making both the faculty and administrators and students aware of them and pledging to neutrally, even-handedly enforce them. We'll see whether that is actually done. But that quote that you started with, Amna, is so helpful because it separates, distinguishes the functions of academic freedom from freedom of expression. Often those two are lumped together, but as has been so well explained by my co-panelists, they really are distinct in terms of what is protected and what should be protected and what not. So the Berkeley free speech movement, which is now celebrating its 60th anniversary, many people forget what that was about, but it really was free speech and not academic freedom, because Berkeley was quite typical at the time that you had freedom to express and debate and dissent from theories in the classroom and in your scholarship, but the campus was ruled out of bounds for engaging in political expression. And you had students, I love this theme because to me as a civil liberties, human rights activist, I see this vital interconnection between free speech and other rights, contrary to a lot of rhetoric we hear about you have to choose between liberty and equality. But Mario Savio and other students who became leaders of the free speech movement had spent the summer registering black voters in the Deep South and came back to campus wanting to recruit other students to participate in the civil rights movement. And they were not allowed to do that in the public spaces at Berkeley. And so I think, educating for and training students while they are still students to raise their voices and use their education for whatever they believe is social justice or human rights. But conversely, in the classroom, we see examples of faculty members who are supposed to be teaching, I don't know, anthropology, not probably a good example, who are then pontificating about the war in the Middle East. And who cares what their position is on those substantive issues? That is not an appropriate use of classroom time, and it is actually a violation of the professional responsibility that is part and parcel of the professional privilege of academic freedom.
So Nadine, you're making me jump to a question that I was going to ask later, but since you've broached the topic, I agree with you entirely that, academic freedom comes with academic responsibility. So you cannot go into a classroom and pontificate on things that are irrelevant and, regardless of your viewpoint, do not pertain to the subject matter in a way that you can teach with integrity. But let me ask you a little bit about extramural speech. So according to the AAUP, academic freedom protects faculty right to freedom in teaching, freedom in research, but also freedom of extramural speech, which means that you can speak on matters of public concern without any kind of pressure from the administration or any other kinds of pressure. So we've seen recently that the extramural speech of faculty has been curtailed quite radically. Most recently, we had the case of a tenured professor, Maura Finkelstein, I'm sure you've all read about it, who claims that she was fired for anti-Israel comments. We have Raz Segal, who is an American Jewish scholar who's very critical of Israel's actions right now, and his job offer at the University of Minnesota was rescinded. Now, I'm citing cases where pro-Palestinian speech or speech that's critical of the state of Israel has been the result of firing. That's not the only instance. We've also had people who have spoken pro-Israel who have faced consequences. But my question really is, how do we square this circle? Is this concerning to you? And are colleges and universities overstepping their bounds in terms of regulating faculty speech?
I'll start, but Keith has written a fantastic article and book precisely on point, so you all deserve to hear what he wrote so brilliantly, and I've had a chance to read. But just a really wonky point, which is that extramural speech, technically speaking, is not a matter of academic freedom. There's a historical reason why in the AAUP's famous declarations of academic freedom principles, first in 1915 and secondly in 1940, lumped this extramural speech together with the appropriate concept of academic freedom, namely freedom of research and freedom of teaching. And the reason that was done, as has been explained in detail by another wonderful new book about academic freedom by David Raban at the University of Texas Law School, and before that by William Van Alstyne, who was a longtime general counsel of the AAUP. At that time, the Supreme Court's First Amendment free speech jurisprudence was very impoverished, and it did not extend to any expression by any government employees, including public university faculty members. Since then, the free speech doctrine has caught up, and professors now, so let me just, to summarize what the impoverished state of the law was until the middle of the 20th century. Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he was a Massachusetts justice, made a famous quip that sadly represented the law at the time. A police officer had been fired for making a political statement in his spare time, and Holmes said that was completely appropriate because you have a right to free speech, but you don't have the right to be a police officer. And that same logic was applied to university professors. You have a right to speak, but you have to choose between your government job or your faculty job and the speech that now the Supreme Court recognizes that all of us have as citizens in our capacity as being members of this political community. So now, quite technically speaking, it is part of that free expression right that protects the students' rights to, speak about politics on the quad, that also protects faculty members' right that you don't give up the right to say offensive things and uneducated and stupid things on social media by virtue of being a professor. You may not make those same stupid and offensive statements in class or in your scholarship. But there is one connective tissue, and Keith can probably tell you the exact wording, but a faculty member's extramural speech, according to the AAUP, may be considered if it shows demonstrable unfitness for your scholarly, for your professorial responsibilities. But then the AAUP goes on to say it almost never is going to be relevant, and it has to be taken into account with the rest of your work. And I think, Keith, you say that it almost never, maybe never, should be taken into account.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's worth emphasizing, I guess, why we want to protect this kind of extramural speech at all, because it's not fundamentally obvious. And in fact, it was deeply controversial at the beginnings of the AUP as to whether they ought to advocate for extending these kinds of protections to faculty who are speaking in public, in particular speaking in public about matters that are not part of their scholarly expertise. If we think the logic of academic freedom fundamentally is we want to be able to protect scholars to talk about matters within their expertise, in their classroom and in their scholarship more generally without fear of being fired or otherwise censored by their university employers, we think the rationale for doing that is because we want to advance knowledge more generally. And if we don't give scholars the freedom to explore those controversial ideas in their work, we're not going to advance human knowledge more broadly. But if that's true, why should we also protect them to express their political opinions online, for example, on social media? That doesn't advance human knowledge in any particular way that's crucial to the mission of the university per se. And there are plenty of academics at the very beginning of these fights in the early 20th century who said, and moreover, we shouldn't bother. It's just going to get us into controversies. There's no reason to try to protect that kind of speech. Really, faculty shouldn't be talking about politics out in the world more generally. They ought to stick to their knitting and focus on their scholarly work, et cetera. And I think part of the reason why the AUP winds up thinking that they need to embrace this and why universities wind up embracing this kind of protection is recognizing you create a massive loophole for censorship in university environments if you don't protect this kind of speech. So, for example, I write in part about originalism as a method of constitutional interpretation, how to think about how we ought to engage in constitutional law more generally as part of my scholarly work. So I publish scholarly work in that regard. I teach about that kind of stuff, et cetera. If my extramural speech is not protected, if I were to go on a podcast or say something in social media or write an op-ed or give a public talk in which I say the exact same things that I say in my scholarly work, that would be wholly unprotected. And someone then complained about that stuff and somebody then decided, well, we don't like somebody around who says those kinds of things. Well, I can't fire them because they wrote it in their scholarly book, but I could totally fire them because they wrote it in an op-ed. And so you wind up with this backdoor possibility of really suppressing and restricting the kinds of ideas that can be talked about on college campuses, including scholarly ideas that can be talked about on college campuses if you don't provide robust protections for faculty to engage in this kind of public discourse more generally. Not to mention, of course, you lose the ability of people to engage in civil liberties more generally, speaking about matters of public concern more broadly, including about politics that they may not themselves have any particular special expertise about. And so if universities are going to be the robust intellectual environments that we want, and we're going to provide the kind of protections that we need in order for faculty to operate on the cutting edge of knowledge, we need to protect them not only in what they do in their scholarship in the classroom, but also in these other environments more generally. There is an argument, though, to be said that that even those kind of expressions can become concerns about people's scholarly fitness. One mechanism by which this can play out is thinking about, well, what if I say something about my subject matter expertise that is so extraordinarily stupid when I say it in public on social media that it calls into question my competence to be in the classroom teaching that same material, right? And that's a potentially real possibility, right? That people have exposed the fact that they are professional incompetents and quacks by going out in public and talking about their matters of expertise. And part of what the AUP would emphasize is say, we should not rely simply upon the evidence of what somebody said in social media, for example, to come to that conclusion. It may be they look like a fool on social media, but we really should want good evidence about what are they doing in the classroom, what they're doing in scholarship, et cetera. And maybe social media is a good reason to go look and say, what are you doing in the classroom? And that's what you're saying in public. But we should be very cautious to make inferences about what people are saying in public that suggest they're not being very competent in the classroom. There's also this backdoor that we see increasingly the case now, not so much a question, I think, in earlier days of these debates about what does it say about your character? And so regardless of your substantive knowledge and whether or not you're a quack, there's a question about, can students trust you? Do students like you? Do they feel offended by you? Would they feel comfortable in your classroom because of the stuff you said in public? And so have you undermined your ability to perform your job in the sense of you can be a trusted instructor because of things that you've said in public that's much more passionate and fiery, inflammatory, because you're engaged in inflammatory and passionate public arguments in general. And I think likewise we want to be extraordinarily resistant to that kind of concern, and not least of which we can see how that's going to be deployed in a university environment. It's not going to be deployed in an even-handed fashion. Instead, we're going to pick out the people with the kinds of substantive opinions we disagree with and say, well, because of you expressing those particular substantive opinions, we now have concluded you're not the kind of person that can be trusted in the classroom. And so we have to remove you from that. So again, providing these kind of neutral protections, it doesn't matter what the content of the speech is and the like across the board, no matter how much and how intensely we might disagree with those particular opinions, becomes critical if we want to maintain a kind of robust intellectual environment that's going to occur on college campuses more generally and not invite singling out people by university administrators to say we're going to punish you. And fundamentally, the real reason why we're punishing you is because we don't like the content of your ideas.
I want to make a steelman argument argument, which I project we're going to hear more of at Academic Freedom Alliance and other academic freedom organizations, and that is just as people now have become familiar with content-neutral time, place, and manner regulations, the concept of Title VI and universities' obligations to take steps to remediate hostile environment harassment when there are complaints of it, as we've been hearing now from pro-Palestinian students or Arab or Muslim students and also Jewish students or Israeli students. The university, and this is a statutory duty that applies to every institution, public or private, that receives government money, which is essentially almost every single educational institution. And so I think universities are going to say, well, it's not just a matter of questioning the professor's character or whether students' feelings are offended, but can a student reasonably fear that they're going to be subject to discrimination in the classroom by a professor who has made extramural statements that are very disparaging toward, pick whatever category you want, whether it be Zionists and Jews or Palestinians and Muslims, and that the university, once there is a complaint that is made, the university has a duty to take steps. Now, put this together with evidence. I know it's contested, but they're evidence or allegations of so-called implicit or unconscious bias. So what if the professor, doesn't overtly do anything to discriminate? The professor may unconsciously be doing that, and you as a university have an obligation to protect me. Does that mean that the university will stop the professor from teaching required courses, allow students to opt out of a particular class? I think we're going to be seeing more and more of these cases.
Yeah, we are in very kind of muddied waters in this case, right? There is a lot of kind of interpretation that this is subject to. But let me move, talking about civil liberties and the backdoor censorship, Keith, that you mentioned, there are ways in which what is happening on college campuses can be interpreted as exactly that. So the new policies that are anti-encampment, of course, they're value neutral, seemingly, but those kinds of policies coming hot on the heels of pro-Palestinian speech being shut down can be read in a particular way. And also, there are a number of universities who are adopting definitions of anti-Semitism, like the one by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which are very broad. And indeed, Kenneth Stern, who's one of the chief authors of it, and a good friend of yours, Nadine, has said that this was never meant to be used on college campuses. So I'm interested to know, what do you think about these policies as a backdoor to censorship and an encroachment on the civil liberties of people on campus? JoAnn, we'll start with you.
There are many cases where you see the government basically enact a rule because they're trying to shut down speech. Like, they see the speech, they don't like it, so then they put in a rule that's ostensibly content neutral, viewpoint neutral, and then start enforcing it just because they want to shut down that particular speech, which I think is really some of the issues that we're worried about with universities doing right now in reaction to they don't like these protests, so they now want to shut them down. And while they are allowed to do reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and as Keith said, the purpose of the university really has this educational function. And so there are definitely reasonable restrictions a university can put in place to make sure students are able to learn, able to get to class, able to access campus buildings, able to sleep at night, or in the morning, I suppose. And so what we don't want to see is these being used in ways that are singling out certain speech to punish it. If a university, these universities, we're seeing them say they're going to enforce them neutrally, they're putting in these policies, they're going to be neutral, but are they in practice? And I think that's where the real concern is. If we're going to shut down pro-Palestinian speech, are we also going to shut down pro-Israeli speech? I mean, is that you have to basically do both. And I think most of us on the stage are free speech advocates. What we want to see is for the universities to enforce these rules in a way that allows maximum free speech. And the rules should be in favor of allowing all the viewpoints, even the hateful ones. which I know Nadine has done a lot of work about, but as soon as we start trying to pick out what we can choose as we can shut down something because it's hateful, which is not in compliance with the First Amendment at all, which allows hate speech, but everyone's definition of it is very, very different depending on their perspective. And so that's why having the university set back and really be neutral in how it enforces policies, but having these policies be very permissive of free speech, and really just be in place to ensure that the educational mission is taking place.
You know, the question about whether the adoption of an ostensibly constitutionally appropriate neutral rule, even a desirable rule, whether it's really a pretext to either shut down or to convey a particular viewpoint also arose recently with respect to the rash of universities suddenly adopting policies of institutional neutrality. Many people thought that that was well timed to avoid saying anything condemnatory of the Hamas attack on October 7th, or perhaps slightly to broaden the lens to avoid saying anything about that particular controversy when the universities had been, just promiscuously issuing statements on anything under the sun. And I think what we have to do with all of these policies is take them on good faith, but really monitor to make sure that they are consistently and even-handedly adhered to.
I think there is a challenge about the development of these policies over time that it is worth taking into account the fact that universities do in fact learn, and
we hope.
So we hope, right? And sometimes they do, in that there are particular experiences that they encounter. Students get creative about how they engage in their activism. The university realizes, oh, well, that's going to be a problem going forward, and so we need to adjust our policy in order to account for that, in order to rule it out down the road. And then students complain, well, 3 years ago you allowed this activity, now you're not allowing it anymore. And sometimes the answer is you're acting in bad faith and this is pretextual and we just don't like the content of your particular speech, and so we're shutting you down in your case, but yeah, we're totally going to allow that if somebody else wants to do it 3 years from now on some other different topic. But sometimes it's just a matter of, you know what, we learned that was actually a bad idea, and we really need to not allow these. And so these encampments are a diversion of this, right? The encampments have become a very popular protest tactic in recent years. I think universities were kind of slow to think through the implications of allowing encampments and what the policies ought to be surrounding encampments more generally. I think there are complicated issues about encampments and whether or not they're always a good idea or a bad idea and what the rules ought to be surrounding them. But I think there's some real downsides to allowing the creation of structures on university campuses. And so not unreasonable for universities to decide we really need a rule against these kinds of structures more generally. And then the question is, are they going to be consistent about applying them down the road and how they actually try to think through the implications of them in particular contexts. But we also shouldn't shy away from the fact, and we need to be clear-eyed about the fact that these are often going to be very complicated and often very context-specific and fact-intensive calculations about the particular rules that get in place. And so it's very easy to talk about time, place, and manner regulations in the abstract. But when it comes to thinking about a specific campus, a specific context, and how that's going to work, it often looks much more complicated to actually figure out what the right rule ought to be, and also how do you implement that in principle. And so just to pick on Harvard, for example, since they, one, went through a lot of effort to try to think through these rules, but two, find themselves still in a world of hurt trying to figure out, constantly responding to activists about what the rules are going to look like in practice. So, for example, Harvard was confronted with this problem of, do you allow protest in the library? It goes to this question again about how do you deal with the fact that you want a core educational mission, which among the very crucial things you want students to do is discover we have a library, and it actually has books in it, and you go there and you could study on occasion. But you also want to, but this is also a public place in which people congregate, and so is this going to be an opportunity then for an activist to come and get their message out to students who are gathered. And universities didn't have very clear rules, and not only Harvard, but elsewhere as well, about sort of what kinds of protest activities you can engage in libraries. And we saw lots of library protest over the last year or so. So lots of universities, including Harvard, adopted rules saying you can't have protests in libraries. Well, then the question is, okay, what counts as a protest in library? So if I have if I go have a mass sit-in a library in which we're going to sit at the study tables, now I'm going to put big old signs and stickers all over my laptops saying Free Palestine and the like. Am I engaged in a protest activity if I'm doing it? If I set up a bunch of little tent cards like this with political slogans and I layer those all over a table in my library as I have my laptop and I'm reading my book, am I engaged in a protest activity, right? And Harvard's now struggling, trying to figure out, okay, we said no protest in the library, do tent cards with political messages sitting on the reading rooms in libraries, that counts as a protest or not? The answer is actually not entirely obvious what the right answer is in that context, and partially depends upon how disruptive it's really going to be in practice. Can we enforce this in even-handed fashion? Likewise, Harvard has this problem now about what counts as a disruption of somebody else's speaking activities. So if I'm going to have a speaker on campus, can students come and create some kind of heckling moment before they get brought out? I have not looked at the details of Harvard's policy. I've heard it represented that Harvard has effectively adopted, you get a 10-minute rule of disruption of somebody's expressive activities before we say there's a university violation. Well, if I get 50 minutes to have my FedSoc panel talk in the middle of the day, and 10 minutes of it gets eaten up by the protesters, you've now taken a huge chunk of my expressive time by your expressive time under those contexts. So a 10-minute rule probably is not the right kind of rule to have in that kind of context. On the other hand, you do want some kind of rule that sort of accepts the idea that students are going to have some minor disruptive heckling activity before they're ushered out of the room, right? So what should that look like in practice is going to be really tricky. And one thing we should recognize is campus activists are going to be very creative and very lawyerly about figuring out what does the rule allow, what does it not allow, where are the ambiguities in the rule, and how do I exploit them to the maximum degree possible in order to get my point across, as well as on occasion, when do I decide I'm going to just step over the line and violate them in order to force you to try to arrest me or something.
And speaking of lawyers and speaking of Harvard, and I have to say I've been very active in the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech, and here at ACTA I want to underscore my alumna activity. Recently, a federal judge in Boston upheld or allowed to go forward, I'm avoiding the legal terminology here, a complaint that had been brought against Harvard for anti-Semitic hostile environment harassment. And among the facts that the judge, and these are just at the complaint stage, I have to say there hasn't been a trial, so you take the facts as they are alleged, but the allegations that the judge found plausible was that Harvard had discriminatorily enforced its time, place, and manner rules against Jewish and pro-Israeli students and in favor of pro-Palestinian students. And so he's allowing that case to go forward. And one thing that I thought was interesting, I know nothing about the judge, but it's the same judge who had previously dismissed the complaint against MIT for hostile environment on anti-Semitic grounds. So for what it's worth, the allegations about Harvard were more damning than about MIT.
And I think that, I think that, Keith, your example really highlights some of the difficulty in applying these rules in practice. So the 10-minute rule seems sort of absurd when you have a 50-minute, 45-minute lunch break, you're trying to get a speaker in. But at the same time, you can see how that would stop a university from being able to enforce it discriminatorily if everyone gets the exact same amount of interruption. 10 minutes might not be the right amount, but rules like that, they have the pros and cons, right? A bright line rule stops the discriminatory or limits discriminatory enforcement, but it also creates those sorts of issues where you basically say you can go ahead and interrupt an event for 10 minutes, and is that really the message we want to be sending, rather than trying to get students to engage in their protest in a way that actually allows the entire event to go forward.
Yeah, it totally raises the rule standards problem in general. The other challenge, though, I think university campuses are going to have to grapple with, and is not evident, is okay, you create this neutral rule. Let's say in this case, you get 10 minutes before we say the policy's been violated and somebody's going to be in trouble for it. And then the consequence is the Federalist Society events always get 10 minutes carved out of them because activists always show up and take my 10 minutes out of your event, whereas the FedSoc students are never going to show up and take 10 minutes out of the other groups on campus events. And so the conservative groups can always expect my event's going to be 10 minutes shorter than every lefty group on campus is going to have their events. The rule itself, totally neutral. It's a function of how people are then exploiting the rule through the consequence of the activist culture on campus. And I think universities have to take that into account and anticipate that when they're trying to design the rule in the first place, is who's going to be showing up, actually doing the disruptive activities, and what's going to be the implication of trying to accommodate some disruptive activities in ways that allow some kinds of expressive activities, but is going to be playing out in very non-neutral ways in practice.
I think you're fortunate that you get invited to so many FedSoc events, because I've been on many campuses where the Federalist Society has disappeared because the students are so afraid of being associated with a group that's labeled conservative, which means, white supremacist, extremist, and so forth. I just received an email from a student who had worked for FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, before going to law school. And he is a conservative and a libertarian, which in fairness is how FedSoc describes its mission. And he was seeking my advice about whether he should even go to FedSoc events because he's afraid it will be used to stigmatize him. This goes back to the earlier discussion.
I mean, I think what we're coming upon is it's one thing to have policies that can have and give the most space for expression on campus, and it's another thing to have that kind of culture where people feel that they can express themselves. So I'm aware of the time, and I want to leave ample time for people to ask questions, but can I quickly ask you what you think of proposals like Daniel Allen's proposal of private institutions having more strict guidelines for expression on campus. So not following the First Amendment, but restricting speech so that, generalized speech, which if targeted towards an individual would constitute harassment, should be banned on private campuses. Any thoughts on that? We have a very pro-free speech panel, so.
Well, I certainly defend their First Amendment right to make that decision. Let's start with that. But I think for all the reasons that such a large number of universities, including the vaunted University of Chicago itself, which is so associated with the Chicago free speech principles, and before that, the Calvin principles of institutional neutrality. But going back to the very founding of the university, a private institution has taken pride in trying its best to encourage and nurture a culture of free speech. If I can also make a pragmatic argument that I found very compelling as an adjunct to the principled argument about, these principles are consistent with the academic truth-seeking mission. There are a couple of law professors at Northwestern have an article in progress that I've read. They said I could quote it even before it's published, about how strategically universities are in a much safer position if they adopt First Amendment-like principles because of the clarity, because of the case law, because of the consistency that they can avoid the kind of lawsuits and liability that arise, by the way, under contract principles. I mentioned earlier that universities have these policies scattered all over in different publications and, different arms of the university. I think of Jeff Flyer saying, "Who is the university?" The university speaks with many mouths. That creates potential contractual liability. So I love the fact that you can make a double-barreled argument to universities, both for the sake of principle and for the sake of your pocketbook and pragmatism. You ought to voluntarily abide by First Amendment principles.
I also think it's that we don't honor free speech because it's in the First Amendment. Free speech is in the First Amendment because free speech is a value that's important. And so when universities are trying to curtail it, not only do I think they're not living up to their function, they're really not they're not taking the value that free speech adds to the university environment, which is the exchange of ideas, the airing of ideas that are bad even, and having those rebutted and learning from that, and the attainment or seeking of truth, whether you believe in truth or not, but trying to get there. And if we don't have that open expression of ideas, how are students going to engage in these arguments? How are they going to learn what ideas they hold are good and bad and what others hold are good and bad, and really engage critically with ideas? So the idea isn't about what the law is, it's about why we have that.
That's an excellent moment for me to say the floor is open for questions. There's a young man back there with his hand up. Sorry, I have a bias towards young people. Being a professor, I want to hear their voices.
Hi, thank you so much. In your panel, you talked a little bit about how a culture of activism can, disrupt free speech. My question is are colleges overly encouraging of this kind of free speech disrupting culture of activism? That's certainly been my experience applying to college and as a student at Georgetown. So just wanted to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Yes. There's right. We had this embarrassing moment in the last semester of universities finding themselves in situations in which they admitted students whose primary virtue, as signaled on their applications, was, I'm a committed activist. I'd like to come to your campus and be an activist. Universities then stumbled all over themselves to talk about, we have a long history of activism and we really love activism. In some cases, they had fellowships and scholarships specifically given to students and awards given to students for their activism. And then students say, but now you want to arrest me and throw me off campus because I've occupied a building as part of my activism. And so it's like, well, this is what universities brought upon themselves. And instead of emphasizing what we are here fundamentally is an educational institution in which we are trying to focus on our educational mission, and we want to encourage open-mindedness, they have instead constructed lots of aspects of their universities they're really focused on political activism instead. And I can't help but be a little amused by the ways in which this has come back and bitten them as a consequence. And so they need to think very carefully about how do we reconcile these kind of commitments and principles, and while at the same time, I think, keeping a clear vision on what their core mission fundamentally is. And their core mission fundamentally is, one, about advancing human knowledge, not social justice, not about political activism, not about engaging in politics in various ways. It's about advancing human knowledge. And then the question is, how are these other things compatible with that? How do they fit within the context of that mission and the whole? There are some real connections, I think, between some free speech principles and that real concern about advancing human knowledge more generally that really suggests that universities ought to be trying to make as much space available for free speech per se. But saying we're making space available for free speech per se is very different than saying we are elevating activism per se as one of the core values and virtues of our culture. I think that's just a mistake that universities have in fact gone down, and they need to course correct.
And I don't think activism in and of itself is a problem. I think it's how it's engaged in, right? And is it being engaged in a way that fits with the environment, that doesn't detract from the educational mission or from other students being able to go and get their education and participate in it. And so I do think it's incumbent upon colleges and universities, particularly who are encouraging activism, is how do you do this constructively? And why aren't we training students how to engage in these conversations in a way that is constructive?
There was an excellent piece by Tyler Austin Harper in The Atlantic about this vis-a-vis Columbia, which I highly recommend reading, very much in line with what's been said. So, next question. The gentleman in the center.
I wanted to ask you about graduate students. Graduate students, on the one hand, are students. They're entitled to free speech protection under the Davis test and so on. On the other hand, you could regard them as employees. Certainly, they bring a lot of Title VII liability with them. Where do you see this all shaking out in terms of graduate student regulation vis-a-vis extramural statements, statements inside the classroom, and so on?
I think that's a great question, and my own view, I don't think we may have case law on it, so I confess I'm unaware of it, but my own view is that if somebody is engaged in the functions of scholarship and research and teaching, then they are entitled to the privileges and also responsibilities that come with academic freedom, regardless of what their status is, whether it be a graduate student who's doing scholarly research with a professor or for a dissertation, or teaching an undergraduate seminar, or whether it be a topic we talked about yesterday in another conference, an adjunct faculty member who doesn't have the protections of tenure, but I think does deserve the protections of academic freedom. And when I say that, let me underscore, as the Supreme Court consistently has, that the purpose of academic freedom and its protections is not solely for the benefit of the protected instructor or institution. Rather, it is for the benefit of all of society. And I think that's a really important perspective to have, especially in a climate where, for some understandable reasons, there is a lot of hostility toward academics and toward universities, that we should remember this is not just a special privilege that they get to enjoy. It is something that has consequences, positive consequences for all of us who benefit from universities pursuing fearlessly and vigorously their core mission of advancing and disseminating truth.
Question right back there.
Okay, so you were talking about what professors should and should not be able to say in the classroom. I thought, well, we just had a good example of it in the news. The professor who said all the white men who don't want to vote for Kamala Harris should be lined up and shot. So I was wondering what you guys think about that. Should he have said that in the classroom? Should there be any repercussions for him? I'm going to keep him away from my dad and from my fiance.
So this instructor has been separated from the university. It's unclear whether he was fired or voluntarily removed himself from the university. He was an instructor of health sports, and there's a viral video, if you haven't seen it, is accessible, of a 32-second clip of him in front of a classroom expressing these sentiments, and then realizing he's being recorded and say, I hope the dean doesn't see this. There's lots of context missing from this, right? That we just don't know about what happened in this situation. So for example, it's unclear whether this occurred in the midst of a class or this is something that occurred before class. For example, he's just having conversations with students, but it's in a classroom. But is it in the midst of a class? We don't know. We don't know what the surrounding context is of what the discussion looks like more generally and how it's received by students. So if it's in the middle of a class, for example, we don't know what was being talked about in the class more generally or how this fits in. We also don't know anything about this guy's larger track record. So we don't know what he's said in other contexts, if this is a frequent feature of his classroom conversations, or if this is a one-off that's a little unfortunate in this regard. So, I think generally speaking, right, this is unprofessional behavior. If it occurred in a classroom context in a health sports class, right, there's no reason why he ought to be engaging in political advocacy of any sort, even laying aside the particular inflammatory nature of the rhetoric he engaged in that context. In Kansas, in its public statements about this, has emphasized the inflammatory nature of the commentary, right, that he shouldn't have had suggestions of violence in his rhetoric. Whereas my concern is to say, why is he engaging in political advocacy in his health sports class? Right, that's professionally inappropriate behavior anyway, and universities can properly step in under those circumstances. But again, I need a lot more context to know how unprofessional this really is, and certainly it doesn't strike me as probably a firing offense if it turns out it's a one-off, even though it's particularly inflammatory in that kind of context. But generally speaking, faculty need to be thinking, I think, more self-consciously about what their responsibilities are in the classroom and not just thinking about what their freedoms are in the classroom.
And if I can tell something on FIRE, to which I'm devoted as a senior fellow, I thought that FIRE's statement really fell into the common pattern of confusing academic freedom with free speech, because FIRE very correctly pointed out that, and in fairness, and maybe this is what prompted FIRE's focus, in fairness, the university was singling out the allegedly violent, inflammatory nature of the words, and so FIRE pointed out that they were not sufficiently intentionally inciting of imminent violence or satisfying one of the, narrowly defined categories of speech connected to violence that would come beyond the protection of freedom of expression. But Keith is making the very appropriate point that we've got a different standard when it's in the classroom.
Yeah, I like FIRE a lot, and they do a lot of good work. And in this case, I do have some slight disagreements with them, and which I've tried to lay out a little bit. There, I have a blog post on this particular matter on the Volokh conspiracy, in which I both cite sort of FIRE statement about this, but also sort of where I think I disagree a little bit with FIRE on this one.
This is making me think about something I say in class, sarcastically and jokingly to my students, that if they don't hand the assignment in on time, I will kill them. And I think I will now refrain from such expression in my classroom, lest it come back.
You should check and see there's cameras when you're doing it.
Question over there, that gentleman there.
I'm wondering if you think perhaps a code of student conduct might be the guide for multiple colleges, particularly Columbia, that seems to be overwhelmed by the protests, to respond in the same way that the Pomona College president did when she said, you have 10 minutes to get out, otherwise you'll be expelled and arrested, even though this thing had built up over a number of months. That gives them the right to do it when they start expressing themselves that way. And in the same district, of course, there is the UCLA facing the judge that says, no, you have to protect everybody's civil rights, not just theirs. I'm wondering if you have some comments about that.
The question of what discipline to me, I mean, yes, you have to abide by rules, but often there is discretion as to how do you do it. Do you use the university disciplinary resources, including internal security personnel? Do you call in the police officers, as Columbia did quite quickly? And as is true in our criminal legal system more broadly, I think the fact that you do have the legal power to do something does not necessarily mean that it is the most effective way of advancing your goal, including the goal of minimizing disruption to the educational process. I mean, when Columbia called in the police the first time, that's what gave rise to much more massive protest and encampment, not only at Columbia, but all over the country. And there also is a really adverse impact on free speech, which FIRE, now say something really laudatory about FIRE, did a fabulous addendum to, it's now the 5th year in a row that it's done an annual ranking of the free speech climate on many, many campuses. And this year, taking advantage of the educational opportunity of the encampment experience, FIRE did another survey of specifically what was the overall impact on the free speech climate of those campuses that had encampments, and taking into account what the university's response was. And not surprisingly, for the campuses that did call in the police and engage in arrests, there was a dramatic negative impact on the students' confidence that they had free speech in general on campus, not only the right to encampments or to express themselves on those issues in particular, but in general. So this ties back again to the first panel. If we want to create a culture of free speech, calling in the cops is probably going to be counterproductive.
Thank you, Nadine, for that point. I think it's exceptionally important, because I think as educational leaders, we have the burden on us is heavier to try and brace ourselves and see perhaps some violations instead of doing what we are legally entitled to do.
Or have an educational response rather than a punitive one.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question, or maybe even two more. That young gentleman there.
The discussion of the permission of encampments and protests is quite fascinating. And when I look over our materials, words and terms that jump out to me are prevent encampments, control the universities, maintain rules. And Mr. Whittington, you stated, you quote, need to rule against these kinds of structures. My concern here is universities have historically been hotspots for resisting authoritarianism, such as in Seoul in South Korea. And this is often why authoritarian leaders, such as Augusto Pinochet, Pol Pot, etc., have gone after, have attacked, and have imprisoned academics and students for protest. So if we continue to use this kind of rhetoric, do we run the risk of creating a chilling effect on free speech and on students' ability to resist authoritarianism and overall illiberal influence?
So part of the challenge, I think, on all these things is try to be clear about what we're talking about and clear about what the rules are, and so and why we're enforcing them, right? And so this worry about is it going to send a broad chilling effect to members of the campus community if we actually enforce rules against disruptive activities, for example? I'm a little skeptical, one, that it is, and two, that I care if at that level, right? In part, this is an educational question about how we convey to the campus community what kinds of things we're going to protect and what kinds of things we're not going to protect. And if we say, if you occupy the president's office, we're going to say you're going to be subject to discipline and there are going to be consequences to occupying the president's office. And on the other hand, if you write op-eds in the student papers or march around on the quad with signs the president doesn't like, we're not going to do anything to you under those consequences. That's creating the culture you want on the campus. And you have to actually enforce it and be clear about it. But if instead people will say, well, my protest activity and expressive activity was punished harshly because all I did was occupy a building, and yet somebody told me I couldn't do it, I'm not too worried about that. And so then, but there are these questions about, I think there are hard questions about thinking about, again, the details of what these policies are like, and specifically this context of thinking about encampments. I think my own inclination about the encampments initially was universities ought to be pretty accommodating to these kinds of temporary structures as part of protest activities. There's symbolic reasons to want to have certain kinds of structures as part of your protests, and universities, for example, ought to be accommodating to them and the like, et cetera. I think the Occupy Wall Street movement, on the other hand, also suggested there are real sanitation and safety concerns with having long-term encampment structures as part of your protest activities, and I think universities have to be genuinely concerned about that. I think that some of the events that occurred this last semester also suggest if you allow students and other activists to build hard structures on your campus, and then it is time to try to clear those things out, you can find yourself in a very dicey situation about how we actually clear those things out, because they become bunkers and not just symbolic expressive activities.
On encampments, I have to say I was asked to do a debate in September on Constitution Day at the Yale Political Union. The proposition was whether encampments should be banned, and I took the negative position. Because I think this is completely consistent with what you said, Keith, that it is a very fact-specific assessment that will vary very much campus by campus, and by the way, encampment by encampment, because that's a term that has been used not only to apply to permanent structures, not only to apply to 24-hour occupancy. So the devil or the angel is in the details, and at Columbia, which has, an urban small campus, it's very hard to even find a space for any kind of encampment that is not disruptive noise-wise and physical space-wise. But at Cornell, which is, a huge campus, they adopted and announced introduced, I thought, a terrific new rule that said, we're choosing a place that's not quite the prominent place that was occupied last semester because that wasn't fair to other groups that wanted to use it, but we found another place that's also prominent that's not going to be disruptive.
Yeah, there's not a one-size-fits-all, I think, on these things. Yeah.
And I think we have time for one last question, if there is one. And gentleman back there.
Thank you. Matt Koob, Institute for Humane Studies. I want to return back to a theme and press a little bit. It seems that free speech and truth-seeking are, of course, mutually reinforcing under the right conditions. But in the absence of a good sort of culture, they can actually be in tension with each other. And so thinking about the educative function of the university, we've talked a lot about in this session about rules. But what about sort of the right sort of cultural norms that enable people to come together to use evidence and reason to engage with each other and do that in a productive, systematic way on campus? And it turns out it's hard to reason while you're protesting. And so my question is, what are some examples of some institutions that you have seen that are doing a really good job of not only maintaining civil liberties, but also in ensuring that there are good sort of cultural norms amongst faculty and students that actually enable the sort of discourse that we really need in America's colleges and universities? Thanks.
I mean, one thing that we've seen a lot of programs pop up lately is like civil discourse programs. ACTA has one, which I was delighted to hear is now working at possibly going to freshman orientations, which I think is really valuable. We've started doing that with orientation where we're at. We have something called the Scalia-Ginsburg debate series where it does just what you would guess, brings together opposing viewpoints. But I think more to it is these programs where we're training students to engage with ideas that they hate is really important, because it turns out once they start engaging with each other, they realize that maybe they have more in common, or the ideas might share some underlying values, even though they go about it in very different ways. And getting students to actually start listening, and that's what you do in a civil discourse program, I think is really important to creating this culture where they can come together and have these open discussions that are open to all ideas and viewpoints and can be constructive.
I mean, it goes back to sort of the core educational function of universities and what they ought to be performing ultimately, right? But what universities ought to be doing is not simply providing platforms in which you can have activist groups offering competing messages, but also, in particular, trying to host and specify activities on campus in which you're going to bring diverse viewpoints together. You're going to have people actually talking to one another. You're going to elevate expertise and not just amateurism on those issues. And universities ought to be places, and when they're operating most effectively, in which they are highlighting our capacity to actually talk seriously about important ideas in a serious way and across those differences. And too frequently, universities find themselves instead, we're going to be in separate camps in which they're going to be shouting at each other across the quad. And that's just not productive and not what universities ought to be doing. And so trying to organize things and to actually bring people together into a room and have a conversation would be very helpful.
Eboo Patel, who is the founder of Interfaith America and very active in all kinds of academic freedom organizations, wrote an essay recently, I think in Inside Higher Ed, in which he said that his high school senior age son is applying to college, and he and his wife said to this son, look, we're not going to pay the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars for you to go to any campus where students are just standing there on the quad shouting epithets at each other, because you can do that for free in any public park.
I'll take this moment to just say, I mean, in responding to your question, in terms of which institutions are doing it well, I don't know if it's happening well yet, but Nadine and I were just at Vanderbilt University, and I know over there the president, or the chancellor I should say, has taken active steps to model and to set up initiatives where dialogue can take place. So I think this is a place where educational leaders can really, go forth and initiate opportunities to create that kind of culture of conversation and listening. So with that, I'll close our panel today, and I was inspired by the mention of Du Bois on the previous panel, and I think it's worth referring to another quote of his where he said, "Of all the civil rights for which the world has struggled and fought for 5,000 years, the right to learn is undoubtedly the most fundamental. The freedom to learn has been bought by bitter sacrifice, and whatever we may think of the curtailment of other civil rights, we should fight to the last ditch to keep open the right to learn." Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, that's terrific.